Hello, guys, and welcome back to another installment of Galley Stories, Stories of the Bering Sea and Beyond. I am your host, Mark Kaler. And before I get started today, I just want to give a shout out to John Ness and Aaron Cornett on the fishing vessel Pacific Prince and the entire crew with them and the entire crew of the FV fishing vessel Seymour. So today's guest is Captain John Halhjem. How you doing today, John?
Doing good.
So, another Ballard born and bred, or not really bred maybe, but born in Ballard. Let's start there.
Probably a hybrid would be the right word. So, born in Ballard, emigrated to Norway when my family, or with my family when I was 5, and grew up, did my school, and most of my thing over there. Came back to the U.S. when I was 21, and came back due to I had choices. I could stay and do military service in Norway, or I could come back here, and I chose the latter. Plus, my dad had worked in Alaska in the 60s and early 70s, so he had connections over here, and his reputation helped me get a job in Alaska in those days. Because he had sailed as engineer back in the days with some of the older Norwegian kind of, what should I say, the captains of industry, some of the guys that became the big factory trawler owners, and it became something here in Alaska in the 70s, 80s, and so.
Now, you went back when you were 5 to 21, so during that time over in Norway, your dad owned a shipyard over there.
He kept fishing in Alaska for 4 more years after we moved to Norway, and he commuted back and forth. And in the meantime, he built up a shipyard, smaller shipyard, where we dealt with pleasure boats, fishing boats, and various other boats.
And which part of Norway is this?
This is close to Bergen on the west coast of Norway.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any good childhood memories of being raised around that shipyard?
Well, it was a lot of interesting stories to listen to some of the old-timer fishermen that had fished in the 50s and 60s in Norway, especially during the big herring bonanza they had in the 50s. And, that was always fun to sit and listen to those old people that had stories to tell. And they were good storytellers, too. And they came to my dad a little bit because he had industry experience with fishing from Alaska and other places. Mm-hmm. So it helped out. And so it got me interested in fishing and boats, which I was around, from I was little, so. And, during my schooling, when I was done with regular school, I went to engineering school to become an engineer on boats. And I worked in my dad's shipyard 3 years before I decided to come over here. So that was pretty much that.
Turning wrenches, learning every part of the boat.
Yeah, welding, wrenches, machining, engine work, everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good experience to have, especially to be on boats, because you learned to be independent. You could do a lot of things. You didn't specialize in just one thing.
And I would imagine that at the time when you were turning 21 and decided to come over here, that history really helped too, not just to...
Oh yeah, no, because I had schooling and came over here with all I needed was sea time to get my license. And, due to me having that experience and my dad's reputation, it was not hard for me to get a job. But the first job I got was actually on a longliner I went up to, and that was a different experience, I must say. Because
before you start that, can I ask you came back over at 21, did you come alone? Did you have...
I came alone, but I had... my dad's sister lived over here, so I had a place to come to. So okay. I stayed with them probably for the first close to a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, first job. Didn't mean to back you up there, but I wanted to kind of know if you came.
So first time went up, there was a summertime fishing up on a longliner. It was for Jubilee Fisheries, and the boat was called Zenith. It was a Gulf shrimper style of boat. And first time it came up, I had to help them offload the boat. It was all manual labor. They made blocks, and you had to carry them up by hand on a pallet and stack them inside a
frozen
container.
Blocks or
frozen blocks. And the living quarters on that boat was also, and we were 9 people on board, and water on longliners is essential for doing, because you need to use fresh water in the block, and you need to use it for other things. So water was not for showers on those boats.
No.
No.
How long were you out at a time?
We were out. I did 2 trips, I think, on that boat. We were out for 3.5 weeks, I think.
Mm-hmm. And that was your first fishing experience?
In Alaska.
In Alaska.
Yep.
And were you engineering or deckhand?
I was just deckhand the first time. Because
Okay.
they had an engineer. But that was the first time up there.
Now, you said it was like a Gulf shrimp style boat. Can you explain a little bit? Because you of all people we've had on here,
Yeah.
really had the experience of knowing what the different classes of boats are, besides probably Doug Dixon. But what's the difference between a Gulf shrimp boat and one built right here in
Well, first of all, the standard between a Gulf-built boat and a Northwest-built boat is quite a difference. They're not built necessarily for the weather we have in Alaska, the Gulf, and they have an open bow on them. This one did, and but it was summertime when I was up there, so weather wasn't really an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I call them inferior compared to the Northwest. Well,
just not built as tough?
No.
So you came back after that trip and then
Came back, traveled around a little bit in the U.S., had some good time, and and then later on that year, then I got a job with Alf Servik on the Rainier, which is also one of the founders of Glacier Fish Company. So, which my dad worked on. He worked on that boat, incidentally, when it was brand new in 1972, well, it was 71 or 72. He had been engineer on that boat when it was brand new. So I still could find a few tape marks down there with his handwriting on it when I got on board.
that's kind of cool.
Yeah, so, and then my captain at that time was Harold Manus, which was a Norwegian skipper from Karmøy that had been around for many years. And he had also owned boats, and well, I did most of my fishing with him since until he quit permanently. So he was an interesting guy, and by the way, Harold, he has passed away now. I mean, probably 6-7 years ago. But he was one of those. He did not know much about the engine room, and I did, so that worked, and that was probably not a bad situation.
And how long were you on that boat then?
I was on a Rainier for a year and a half, and one time Alf Servik came and took it up. We went up to do San Matthew blue crab. That was fun. But another thing I should say is a friend of mine came over here 6 months after I was, and his name was Isaac Lequin, and he started fishing for the first time on a different boat, but later on he started fishing with us. So us two, we stayed together fishing until and eventually moved back to Norway.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was on the Rainier then for a year and a half, and then later on Harold got a job with a guy down at Tacoma, an older gentleman, I mean wealthy guy that had made it good in real estate, and he kind of had a crab fishing boat as a hobby in a way. And that boat, that time, was called the Tempo Sea. I was on that boat probably for a little over a year, and we fished around. I mean, did blue crab, king crab, opelio, and beard eye. And with that boat, we used to deliver with Rainier too. There was an old cannery in Academ called Deep Sea, which was kind of a little motley crew in the day, you know. But one time I remember at the time on the Tempo Sea, Harold got pissed at Deep Sea, and we went to Trident and delivered once. And that was, they had just built the shore plant that time. So
There in Acton?
yeah, in Acton.
Mm-hmm.
There was no pollock plant, nothing. It was just the crab plant in those days.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I fished there as engineer. It wasn't too long after, in 1990, 88 is the first year I went up on the Rainier. So in 1990, in April, I'd been around, and Harold all of a sudden said, "Oh, well, I'm gonna go home, so you're gonna have the boat." Yeah. Well, I mean, I said, "Okay, I'll let you pull 40 pot string here, and then we'll go to St. Paul, and I'm gonna fly home."
But you had spent some time in the wheelhouse prior to that, right?
I'd done my watches and stuff, but he never let me drive the boat and dock it or something, you know, like that much, you know. Well, I knew how to drive boats, but I wasn't.
Now,
I
how
wasn't
big
used
was
to
she?
driving. I was a 110 footer,
Okay.
but that was also a Bender built boat. And then it wasn't long after that, then Harold got a hold of a different boat called Constance 4,
Well, wait a minute. I want to.
Yeah.
We're jumping too far ahead. You just got the boat,
Yeah.
and so I want to hear about that first experience because that was your first time.
Yeah, it was. But it was also happens to be, as it was in those days, opilio fishing lasted from January until almost June.
Yeah, you were grinding.
Yeah, and then they had an eastern quota and they had a western quota. So when they shut down the eastern quota, a lot of times the ice would be down, and you just had a tiny little triangle to fish until the ice started receding. You know, and there was like 100 boats in there, so much gear, and that was scratch fishing. And fished there probably for one trip, and then the ice, we took a chance, the ice started going, and we went up north, and we started actually getting some good crabs. So we did, I think I did 3 trips on that boat that year. During those days, then we had gotten Trident as our market, and they had floaters up at San Matthew that bought opilio back in those days. And I remember doing one trip up there, first time on the north side. That time, there had been a big freighter that had drifted on land there the fall before, called the Milos Reefers, a Greek freighter. And that boat was still intact, and most of the stuff on board was still there. That's probably one of the most interesting stories I've ever done in Alaska. We had a skiff on board, so we could actually go over there and get on board and look at it.
It had been there for how long?
Since October, the year before this, probably in April.
So,
but you know, it was iced over most of the winter, you know, so nobody can get to it.
I hear a good story coming here, John.
Yeah. Yeah, so we went on board and got a lot of stuff out of that boat. I mean, there was, in those days, it was, people could have a beer on the boat in those days, and at that time we had been at sea for many months and didn't have any. And then you came on board that boat, suddenly we saw 80 cases of beer sitting there at us.
Oh, party time.
Yeah, so we had a little fun for a couple days. Went back fishing, and I think in May the season was over, and then we were told by the owner of the boat we're going to bring it home to work on it. So we
boarding that vessel wouldn't have been piracy; it'd have been salvage, right? Because
it was abandoned. It was abandoned ship. It was open access.
I can't imagine how it had to be kind of awesome. Actually,
we're not too many places in the world can you do that. A
right.
boat's been sitting there 6 months untouched.
Yeah,
it was somebody had been on board. It was some vandalism had happened. You know, so, but most of the stuff was still there.
Okay, so then you came back home.
Came back home with the boat, and that time we were told, okay, the boat's been sold. We're gonna get another boat. So that's when they had bought a boat called Constance, and we started working on that boat, and then they renamed that boat the Tempo Sea, which was the boat I was on.
Right.
Yeah.
You still with Harold?
Still with
Harold.
Harold.
You back captaining, and you were back in engineering?
Then I became the relief captain. So
okay.
I was engineer and relief. So when he was running the boat, I was engineer, and then when he went home, I ran the boat, and somebody else was engineering. Or you could keep an eye on him anyhow. So worked on that boat and got some good shipyard experience with that boat, because that boat 2 years later, or it was a year later, we did we cut the boat in two and stretched it 30 feet.
Sponsored it?
Well, we didn't sponsor it. We stretched it.
Okay.
And repowered and did a lot of stuff to it. So it was a pretty invaluable shipyard experience, I guess you could say. So, and stayed with that boat, had some pretty good crab seasons with it, especially opilio, because we had able to do pretty good size. We can get 300,000 pounds on board after that, compared to, well, not quite 300, but before we had like 160.
So at that time, what year was this when you stretched that boat?
In 92.
So what were most boats holding at that time?
There were some boats. I mean, an average boat was probably 120 to 180.
So you guys were...
Yeah, but he also had come in the last years before, these so-called mud boats. Those were oil supply vessel boats, which packed a lot more. But a lot of them were catcher processors.
Yeah. I heard you had a really outstanding year one year too.
Yeah, we had 1 million pounds of opilio in, what are we doing in? A little over 4 weeks.
Wow. Wow.
And typically you 3 to 4 days to fill up. It was so much crab, like 800-900 a pot. So that was west of Pribilofs in those days. And
Now, I'm already forgetting the name of this vessel now. The
Constance. It was
Constance.
that was the boat when we bought it.
And then it became, again, the Temple Sea.
Yeah.
Okay. And how long were you on there?
I stayed on that boat until I retired fishing.
Okay.
Yeah, so I stayed with it, and then fished relief here, engineered there, and then 1995 came along. That's when Harold decided, okay, I'm gonna retire. So then I got the boat full time.
Before we move off Harold real quick, because he passed 7 years ago, you said.
Yeah.
You got a good memory of him?
Yeah, he learned us. He taught us a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he was also an old timer Norwegian, so his way of doing things then and our way of doing things today were quite different a little bit. But he'd been around there probably. I mean, been around sea his whole life. He started when he was probably 15 as a merchant marine in Norway, and came to Alaska and became a fisherman. And,
Was he cranky or?
oh, he could be a little cranky every once in a while. But he knew the Norwegian community, which was good for me, you know, because there was a lot of people in that community here. Like, plus he was from Karmøy, which were where most of the crab fishermen from Norway was from.
Been hearing that a lot, actually.
Yeah,
It seems
Karmøy was a lot of people. Because I mean, there was also some from further north, like around Ålesund, but those people did crab too, but they had more experience with trawling, and that kind of fishery. So, but you know, they did both.
So you got the boat in 95?
Mm-hmm. And I worked on that boat as captain until 2002. That's when Bob Oldright, the owner, was getting old and sick, and he felt like selling the boat. So that boat, I had a chance to buy it. I got actually a pretty good deal, but at the time I couldn't quite raise enough money, and I don't know, it's one of those could have, should have, could have. You know, it's like I probably could have gotten a partner or somebody, but you know, I also felt since I was the one on the boat, I was be the one doing most of the work, and somebody else would reap the rewards from it. You know,
So from 21 to, so let's see, came back over. Am I hearing 15 years here then? All in all?
Yeah, from 1988 to 2002. And that's also the same year the crab fishing kind of got rationalized. Because I was also very lucky, I guess you can say at the time, I was there during all the qualifying years, during when the rationalization went through. So I was able to get a benefit out of that as a captain's quota, which was 3% of the quota what the boat had.
And you had been running it during that entire
I've
time.
been running it during those years that was qualifying.
Can you explain that a little bit? Because we've had a couple people talk about the rationalization and their quota, but no one's really pinned down how
the way
it
was,
you.
it's like they had so many years participation, but you also needed recent participation. You couldn't have like 2 years in let's say in the early days, because they needed a couple years recent participation, which the cutoff was 2001 for Ophelia, but I think 2002 for king crab. I had all my time from 95 to 2002, so fit in right in that thing. And that's when that thing started going down. And they still didn't rationalize it fully until, was it 2005 the first? 2005, I think, was the first season day.
That captain's quota, right?
Yeah.
That was assigned to the captain of that boat, correct?
Yeah, because the theory was, because the trawl fishing had gotten rationalized earlier, that, you know, why should the captain is the one that made this quota for the boat, and why shouldn't
He chose the spots.
why shouldn't he get a little piece of the pie? And, you know, they did that time. And
so even if you walked away from the boat, you had your quota, period.
you had the quota. But, you know, the thing was, you were supposed to be present on the boat to use that quota.
Right.
But they relaxed that later.
In those years, can you tell us about your most scariest experience in it? And I'm not talking about terrifying, but just the time when you yourself was just the most uncomfortable, that something was wrong.
Well, I'm going to say probably on the Rainier. One time on the Rainier, we went out west, out to Ada, to try king crab fishing out there one time. And those passes out there, when you get the tide rips, are pretty bad, you know. And didn't feel that comfortable being out there. But the boat I was on later, the Tempo Sea, was a good sea boat. I felt like. I mean, one time I remember we were drifting, and somebody was sitting on watch, and I came up in the morning. It was like 40, 50 foot seas, and the boat was drifting still pretty good. And that time, within a couple hours, 7 boats had windows knocked in that time. That was probably in 2003, 4. No, in 1993, 94 or something.
Mm-hmm.
No. But other than that, I felt safe on the Tempo Sea. It was a good sea boat, and we at least tried to play it safe when we fished. So I felt I had a pretty experienced, good crew. We had a pretty tight knit group we had together. So.
How about some fun times? I mean, other than finding that boat up on the beach with 80 cases of beer,
yeah,
because that had to be a fun time.
Fun times in Alaska or other
on the boats, or in Alaska. Fine.
It was fun always in the days prior to king crab. Back in those, it was like 240 boats got ready at the same time, and when everybody came in to find out what everybody did, and who was the Highlander this year, who did bad, and
they're all in the elbow room.
Room, or back in Akaten, you had the Roadhouse in those days. I think it's still around, but no, it was always fun before and after, especially during king crab. That's when some people made good money and some didn't, and it was derby style fishery. So a lot of times you only had less than a week to fish, and if you didn't get them on the first try, if you didn't get them on the second try, then you pretty much lost out.
Especially right before that rationalization, you're really trying to. You kind of knew it was coming.
Well, not really until it came around, but you didn't know about it the first years when that thing was going.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
But we came out okay. Our boat, we were probably, I don't know, in the 2/3 tier or so in terms of quota, so it wasn't too bad.
Where's the Temple Sea now?
It's still called Tempo Sea. Well, when the old man Bob sold the boat, when I couldn't buy it, then the Burns brothers bought it, or Blue Illusion, or what they're called, the Longline Company, Blue Pacific, anyway, they bought it, and I fished with them for a year and a half, I think, and then I decided, okay, it's enough. I think I'm gonna give it up, and that's when I stopped fishing and started working land job. Yeah.
Which is a port engineer.
Then I started with Trident as port engineer, and worked there and still do, and that's. But I also, after I came on board with Trident, I went up 2 more times to fish a trawler for crab, for the trawler quota. So the Gladiator I fished with. So that was an interesting experience then, to run a big trawler for crab. So
how does that work? Trawling for crab?
No, you have a block. You
fish it exact same thing.
Fish it the same way, but you just have to remove some gear and equipment to do it, to clear up your deck. So, and we did okay. So then got to know, and then 2004 was my last year fishing. Yeah, so that was it. But then,
got any good stories you want to share?
Well, I probably have some good memories about some of the old-timer Norwegians I met during the years. Corey Ness and Tor Ferkingstad,
Let's go there. Let's hear it.
Well, I mean, they had a lot of experience, and they had a lot of stories, and they were respected, and it was nice to see them and talk to them. And so, some of them you still see around today, but some have started... some of the older ones have started disappearing, and so I think what we're doing here, it's good the story to be told, so somebody can hear it. Yeah. So
let's hear one about Corey.
Well, I just met him because he knew Harold real well.
Myrold.
Harold, not Myrold, but Harold Manus. And I remember one time Corey Ness's boat, the boat was called Royal Viking. Him and the captain on that boat, his name was Jonas Jakobsen. He's gone today. We were up to fishing in the ice, and it was so calm up there that we tied 2 boats together in the ice And just hung out together a half a day, 2 crews, sailing on day. It was sunny, nice day out there, and that was Corey Ness's boat. And other people that I fished with those days, Sig Hansen was one I fished with. He became a captain the same time I did in 1990, 91. So, I kind of always measured myself against him, or maybe he did that to me, or, we talked fishing, and we felt we could trust each other a little bit, but not always.
So, isn't that how it works?
Well, yeah. Back in those days, you had the secret you had to follow.
Yeah. Again, the whole premise behind this podcast is like you said, trying to capture some of these stories.
Yeah.
What else do you have to share? Let's remember somebody else who's gone.
Well, Harold Myrold is one guy I gonna always have good memories of, especially in the last 5 years he was living. I knew Harold from before, but after he, when he was in his latter years, I started doing things with Harold. We did things here in Seattle. He was always interested in soccer. We went to soccer games, and I took care of the boat. He ran the Royal Viking, and he also ran the Billiken for Trident at the days. And he was a good old gentleman fisherman. Tough, but his also name was Big Harold, so he was big.
He was a big man.
Oh, he was a nice man, so miss him all the time. Yeah, so him, and somebody else, Leif Norbe was one guy. He was a good friend with Harold. He owned the Scandies Rose. He was one of the highliners up there, and and Magni Ness, we know who was, and
Magni's still around though. I just saw him on Saturday.
He's still around, and some of the other Norwegians was the Johannessens. John Johannessen. He had several trawlers, and
was that Picker?
Picken was his nickname. Yeah. Got to know his sons. Lloyd and Norman Johannessen. Mm-hmm. So we used to do things together. One of the early people I met when I came over. Another guy I fished with quite a bit was Owen Klinge, who now runs the Arctic Sea, the biggest boat up there, with the biggest quota. So we used to fish together.
Well, how big is the boat? How big is the quota?
For that boat?
Yeah.
Wow. I think they have 10% of the Opelio quota, that company alone, or that's coastal villages.
How big is the boat?
Oh, it's a Marco boat, but that was one of the last ones. Yeah, this was back in, was it 95, where they put pot limits on boats. And they built that boat 2 years, or sponsoring it and lengthen it so you can have 400 pots on it. And they did it 2 years before that thing, so that was kind of what didn't work out too well. But his brother used to run the boat at the time, Jorn Kvinge, and he was also one of the highliners back in the days. And they were always known, that company, they were owned by a Danish person at the time. Before this, they were always known for doing it, top notch gear and equipment, everything. They always did well. So I think everybody looked up to those boats a little bit in those days.
Well, you got several classes up in Alaska that really impacted our industry, right? Mm-hmm. So from where I sit, I always hear about the Norwegians, how strict they were, how good their boats were operated. The Danish were meticulous at everything. And the Filipinos actually had a strong presence as well early on. And still a minority.
Yeah.
No, just fishing in general in Alaska. And are still very impactful today. So it's like you have many cultures or generations facing into this industry.
They do. They had the Russians. They had especially in Bristol Bay, the Russians, Italians. They had the Norwegians. They had this. They had groups.
Well, remember Alaska used to be Russia, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But back in the days when I started, the big company up there fishing was actually Arctic Alaska. They had the most boats. Mm-hmm. Trident at the time, they had Billiken, Bountiful, Royal Viking was the crab boats, and then they had, in the early days when I started, I think they only had 2 or 3 trawlers, 4 maybe. But that's after that is when they started really, really growing. Mm-hmm. So Arctic Alaska was the biggest company, I think, during the big days. Yeah.
Did you ever have to assist at a rescue at sea?
I remember one time we were just there for support. It was about the American Star, which another friend of mine used to fish on Harley or Steve Davidson.
Oh, we've had Harley on here.
Yeah, he was on there. But I don't know if he was on there that time. But his captain at the time, he drifted on land up between the Pribilofs there on Whale. I think what was it called? Walrus Island. They drifted up there and they had to abandon ship. And then, I mean, I heard about that time when 7 boats knocked out the windows. There was a couple of fires. I mean, we never ended up assisting at sea with any rescue at the time when I was fishing. But I mean, I heard about plenty of them. And but there was always something, especially during the king crab years when people had big pots loads on there. I remember one year when the Northwest Mariner sank, it tipped over, and there was one time we were leaving somebody got a fire in the boat and they were able to put it out, and so there was always something going on.
Always something going on, something you're trying to dodge.
And there was a couple of times I almost got hurt too. I remember one time a pot started tipping over, and I was lucky enough to be able to lean down and get under it, and it rested on my shoulder when it landed on the railing. So if it wouldn't have landed on that railing, it would have probably crushed me down.
So it kind of impacted the railing and your shoulder at the same time?
Yeah, so I was lucky on that one. And then one year, I always going to remember up there was 2005. No, 1995 was when it was the year we got the highest price ever for Opelio. Remember, I think we got $2.60 a pound. But it was also the coldest winter I think I ever had up there. You would go out there in the morning, had to chop ice to get things ready. You fished for a while, and then midday you had to chop ice again, and then by the end of the day you had to chop ice before you went to bed. It was like
that was 95. So you were still on deck.
I was on deck, and I was also that's when I was relieving. But I was on deck at that time, so that was super cold. But back in those days, I remember Leif Norby on their Scandinavian Rose came in with 300,000 pounds that time, $260 a pound, almost $1 million.
Oh my Lord!
And that was in those days. That was a big paycheck.
Didn't you have a $3 million king crab season at one point?
Well, I've been told my dad back in the days when he fished in Alaska in the 60s, fished on a boat called the Viking, which is still around. Trident used to own it, but they sold it. Somebody still operates as a tender now, but they had.
I think John Franklin does.
He doesn't own it, but okay. I think he's the fleet manager of Southeast Alaska. Okay. He tells it where to go and stuff.
It's still up there running around.
It is. And they had 3 million pounds of king crab on that boat in the 60s on 1 year.
Can you imagine?
And that's another guy that really struck out big in Alaska was a guy called Sam Yelly. He was actually from Ålesund area, Norway. He was the founding member of Glacier Fish, and he was in the early 50s. The first crab boat up there, I think, was called a Deep Sea. They trawled for crab in those days. They dragged for it before they used bottom.
Kind of like scallops.
Yeah,
just
almost,
a little net on the back, kind of.
1954, I think it was the first year they went fishing, and that was on the Deep Sea. That's another boat that burnt and sank down here a few years ago. So yeah, no, there's a lot of stories, and then my dad in 1975 was his last year. Then fishing went on really, really good until 1981, I think, or 82 was when the king crab poof disappeared, and that's when a lot of people had big problems.
A lot of money went out there to build those boats.
A lot of people went bankrupt because back in those days they had was it like 17% interest on the loans on the boat. Try that today, So no, but overall, a lot of good memories, a lot of history, and I'm glad I got to be part of it.
Well, and you married a Norwegian.
Yeah, I did that, which also had a dad that fished his whole life, and she now sells the product, the fish, not the crab, but she sells pollock for Trident. So yeah, She's been here for, 18 years now.
You see your boys going fishing?
We'll see. I mean, I wouldn't mind sending them up there just to get a little dirt under their fingers and say, hey, I've done it. I've been there. I think it looks good on anybody's resume saying you've been fishing, you've been on the boat, you know how to work. It tells you a little bit about the person.
If it's on your resume, you have to have known how to work, right? I mean,
well, if you didn't, you wouldn't have the job, at least not very long. So
yeah, it'd be like a 2-week blip.
Yeah. Well, I must say I had experience with hiring a few people off the beach sometimes, and it was a different standard on some people you hired. Some could make it, and some had no clue. It was.
So speaking of that, if not talking about your kids, because your kids are going to have an absolute easy way into the industry if they want to, because your name will get them their first job. Someone listening today that has no contacts, what do you suggest if this is something they want to try?
Well, it's a little different today. Back in the days, people could fly to Alaska and walk the docks and get hired. It's a little hard to do that today because not so many people get hired off the docks. At least none of the bigger companies do it because the screening you have to go through, the drug test, the this and the that. Smaller companies might still hire you, but you more need to apply to get the job than you did in those days. And but there's we see new young people coming into the industry, and some seem to do well, I think. And it's good to see because it still pays well, and it's a good way for people to save up a little money if they're gonna ever buy a house. It's pretty hard to save up money being home.
It's nice getting that big check.
It is.
In fact, you said earlier when you got off that first boat, that trawler, right? Or that long line, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You toured the United States.
First thing I did, I came home, I bought a car, and I had 2 friends come over, and we drove to California and all the way to the Mexican border.
What was the car?
It was a Cadillac.
Oh, of course it was. Everybody has that first big spend.
Yeah,
normally.
It was fun.
Everybody has that first big spend.
Yeah.
So we're running close out of time here, John. But I wanted to take a moment. We've been doing this deal where folks write in, and you give comments about the show and how it's going. Which, by the way, I appreciate everyone's feedback. Today's though is going to be from Mark Horner. Mark there's been some contact here back and forth, and some with myself and some with Jack Mullen, who you guys heard on episode 1 and episode 3. I want to read it real quick, and then I'll ask for some feedback from you, John. But this was actually directed to Jack from Mark. It said, "Well, hey Jack, I'll let you guys get back to your evening, and thanks for sharing your story with Mark because it's great. It's a great story, man. The whole surfing thing and your whole philosophy on life. You have many sayings. You have a saying where you say most people have a lot of time and a little money, or a lot of money and little time. From that perspective, I really respect how you've been able to carve out a life where you make a lot of money in a certain months and the year, and then have time to go and do the things that you enjoy." Mark, you can also check out Mark's webpage at Beyond 90 Seconds. Really, really cool insight there. But John, any feedback on people writing in and questions?
I mean, people that want to get into this industry. One thing I should have said is also, one good opportunity is to come into the boat when they're in the yard period. That's the good time to show yourself and what you're made of, because people will know right away whether you have the drive and the interest that you need.
That's actually really good advice, because a lot of guys don't want to work shipyard. But that's where you kind of really earn or secure your spot.
That was the way in many times. Back in the days, people would go for free the first trip in the big king crab.
Do you remember when you'd find a guy and they'd have to repair all the nets? I mean, we're talking on the dock still. Repair all the nets, not a nickel. And just work until the captain either thought you could go or not go.
It was very common back in the early king crab days, when they made the big money back in those days. People, it was like $100 a day, And you went out for a 10-day trip. Some people made 50,000, and you made 1,000.
That's a tough pill. That's a tough pill.
Well, that's like it was an incentive to get with the program real quick.
Right. Yeah.
The better you got, the sooner you got there. So.
Before we close out, John, do you have anything else to say?
I'm gonna say that the ocean and the boats and the sea has given me a lot of rewards, and it's been a career worth pursuing for me. It's taken care of me. It got a good living, all that, and it's still possible.
It really is still possible.
Yeah.
It really is.
And I think that's a good way to end it.
I think so too. All right, guys. Any questions for John or any captains we've had on previously? Just send those into mark@galleystories.net. I do encourage you to follow us on iTunes or Facebook or whatever social media site you like. We do appreciate all the support you've given us. And with that, guys, we'll end it here, and we will see you next time.